Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This is going to be the final lecture in our philosophy course. And in this lecture, I wanted to discuss something that is discussed by a great many philosophers throughout history. The ancients, certainly there's a great deal of wisdom and a great deal of literature that has been given to us from those ancients. But even through the modern period and now in the postmodern period, one of the most significant topics, one of the ones that comes up quite often is the idea of a philosophy for having a good life. Just what does it mean to have and to live a good life? And so in this lecture I wanted to discuss 5 things that I think people need to have in order to have a good life. And I owe a great debt to Dr. Robinson in this particular video. I'm going to use the things that he talks about in one of his lectures. He's one of the most influential philosophers on my philosophical view, and so I wanted to pass along some of his wisdom. And so these 5 things are going to come from him, and then I'm going to add bits and pieces of my own, but the 5 major themes that we'll discuss are going to come from Dr. Robinson. But with this theory of a good life, as I say, it's one of the things that the ancients wrote about the moderns and now the postmoderns. We write about this. We philosophers think about these things. They deliberate on these things. Just what exactly does it mean to have a good life? And so I wanted to give you a little bit here in this last lecture about this idea of having a good life. And so some things to reflect on. Certainly there's going to be a quiz, and so it's going to be part of your grade as well. But hopefully you'll take something out of this particular lecture that's more than just philosophical theory. Hopefully there'll be some application in here as well. And so 5 things. The first of the 5 things comes to us from Socrates, and it's this idea of a contemplative life. And what does it mean to have a contemplative life, or to incorporate contemplativeness into your life? Well, the idea here in this particular piece, this particular part of the theory, is that you contemplate. That is to say, that you think about life, and that you begin to make a plan. And so one of the things that I think you need to have in order to have a good life is to sit down, to think about, make a plan for the future, and to try to figure out what it is that you want from life. What is it that you hope to gain, that you hope to be in the end, so that as you're lying in your deathbed, supposedly you're going to be fortunate enough that you live to an old age, and that as you lay there in your deathbed, that you don't think back and think to yourself, I wish I had done these things, or I wish my life had turned out in this way, but instead that you sit down, you contemplate, you make a plan, and you decide on, this is who I want to be, this is where I want to go. And so you actually think about it, that you're not just running in each and any and every direction, wherever the wind blows you, and so that you've got a little bit more than just the day by day, you do this, but sit down and make a plan and try to figure out what you want your life to look like, as I say, so that in the end you don't have those kinds of regrets as you contemplate your life there at the end of your life, perhaps. The second thing, and the first 2 go kind of quickly, and then the others will take more time. But the second thing that I think you need to have in order to have a good life comes to us from Aristotle, and it's this idea that you should have an active life, one where you go out and you put hands and feet to the plans that you make, using that first of these 5 things that I think you'll need. That you put hands and feet, that you actually put your plans into action, so that you have an active life, one that you go out and you live. You don't simply make a plan and then that's great, you've got a plan, but you never act upon it. So the second thing I think you need to do is to actually act. And Aristotle was one who had a very, very active life. In fact, he was the mentor of Alexander the Great. And as Alexander the Great was conquering the known world, Aristotle had sent a number of different types of scientists. They weren't called scientists at that time, But he sent a number of different individuals along with Alexander's army, and they would collect insects and they would collect plants and they would report on the different animals that they were seeing along the way. It was this huge scientific endeavor, and so there was a massive caravan of scientists that went with Alexander the Great on his conquest, and they wrote back. They sent all this stuff back to Aristotle. It's said that that was the most expensive um, scientific endeavor until the launching of the Hubble telescope. And so there was this massive investment that Aristotle had in all things, and this massive interest that he had in all things. And so he invested his life, and he was incredibly active, not just as a philosopher, but he was active in all areas of his life. And so I think that's something that we all need to have as well, is both the plan and then coming along also and putting those things into action. The third thing, and now we'll slow down a little bit here. The third thing I think that people need to have in order to have a good life, a successfully good life, is a certain amount of fatalism. That is to say, a fatalistic perspective, meaning that things are going to happen in life that are going to be beyond our control. There's going to be some things that'll happen that you can't do anything about. And so a lot of times, obviously, those things are going to be bad things, and a lot of times things are going to happen that are beyond our control that are going to obviously be negative, and we need to know that. We need to understand that and kind of come to grips, come to terms with the fact that there are things that are going to be beyond our control, and that we simply have to take the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune as they come to us. I know that as a sports fan, many times I'll be watching a game if I have a particular team that I want to win, and I'll catch myself being very, very anxious about the game, and many times I've had to embrace this idea of fatalism and simply sit back and realize that there's nothing I could do. It's out of my control. There may be something the players can do, but it's out of my control. And that what will happen, and I simply have to let it unfold as it does unfold. And there are many different ways of expressing this throughout history. The Vikings had something, they had three ladies that they called the spinners, who were thought to sit at the roots of Yggdrasil, the tree of life. And it was thought that these ladies were spinning a tapestry or a cloth, or spinning kind of a picture. They were weavers, and that they were weaving the threads of people's lives into this this tapestry of life, into that cloth of life. And that sometimes they would break people's threads, and that was the end of your life, or they would weave it into a good way, or they would weave it in a bad way. And so this idea was that the weavers would weave as the weavers would, and that the things that came to you in life simply came to you, and often, and very often, there was nothing you could do about it. It was the weaver's will. We also see this idea in Roman mythology with the fates, or fate. And so there's this idea that sometimes there seems to be something that's out there that is in control, that is beyond our control, and there's simply nothing we can do about it. And so we simply have to accept the things that come to us as they do come to us, and be they good or be they bad. And in this case, I also think of Lawrence of Arabia. In one of the stories about him, they crossed a particularly dangerous part of a desert, and it was thought that this particular stretch was really dangerous, and the Arabs were. It was such a difficult crossing, they were hesitant to do it. And so in one case, they made the crossing, and Lawrence realized that he had left his aide in the desert. His aide had fallen behind in the caravan. And so he went back into the desert, or he was about to go back into the desert, and as he was about to go back in, one of the Arabs came up to him and said, don't go back in after your aid. It is written that he who goes into the desert, that no one can go into the desert twice and come out again. And so it's such a dangerous crossing. You can really only tempt the fates once and succeed. And Lawrence, in this case, looks at the fellow and he says, nothing is written. And he does go back into the desert, and he does, in fact, rescue his aide. But no sooner had they gotten out of the desert and back into the camp there on the other side, then there was a fight that breaks out there in the camp. And the fellow that he rescued, his aide, was killed in that fight. And so that same Arab later came up to him and said, don't fret about the fact that your aide was killed in this fight. It was written that it was, his time to die. And there just seems to be this kind of idea, this kind of feeling within humanity. And it's not a new feeling. It seems to be within all humanity and within all cultures, that some things are just written, that that's the way they're going to be, and there really isn't anything that you can do about it. That's not to say that you shouldn't try or just leave everything up to fate. It's just that some things are beyond our control. They're out of our hands. And so, as I sometimes contemplate life and where it's going and where it's come from, death is one of those things that I certainly contemplate. I've always been very close to my mortality, meaning that I've always understood that I'm going to die even from a very young age. I understood that my life was at some point going to come to an end. And so contemplating death, and then also contemplating the death of my parents. Now, both of my parents are still alive, but my wife has lost her father, and so there is kind of this this feeling that you get when you're contemplating death, and especially when you're contemplating the death of your loved ones, that you begin to understand that life is transitory, and what that means is that it moves and it moves forward, and the things we have for a time, and the people that we have for a time, and that time will certainly come to an end. And so at some point I will face the fact, I will face the death of both of my parents, assuming that I outlive them, or I will face my own death. I'll face perhaps the death of my wife, those types of things. Life changes and nothing is permanent, and that with this idea of fatalism, we should embrace and we should recognize as we move through life. Part of having a good life is realizing that these things will be lost, that we will have to give them back, that we don't get to keep them forever, neither the lives of our loved ones nor of ourselves. And so we should embrace the idea that those things aren't going to be with us forever, and that will help us to have a good life, because hopefully that it won't just have that kind of negative, pessimistic, dark view that goes along with them, but rather instead what it will do is it will help us to appreciate, and it will help us to take advantage of those things that we have now while we still have them in our lives. And so we do, in the end, we are going to lose these things, and we should be sure that we're appreciating them, and we should be sure that we're taking advantage of them while we do in fact still have these different things. And so a degree of fatalism, the idea again being that not everything that we'll have forever, and some things there's just nothing we can do about it. We'll just have to accept them. And so having an accepting attitude towards the things that come along to us in life can help us to have a better life as well. The fourth thing then that I think we need to have in order to have a good life is a hedonistic outlook, or a hedonistic perspective, or perhaps a hedonistic appreciation for things. Now, hedonism often, I think, gets kind of a bad name, because the idea of hedonism is, it's sometimes put forward that hedonists are those who are always simply out to bring and gain every pleasurable experience they can, every time, all the time. And I think that's a misunderstanding of what true hedonism is. So I think to kind of give you a perspective of hedonism, the opposite end of hedonism is something called Puritanism, and the Puritans are those individuals who often went around only dressed in black or white garb, outfits, and they might only drink water and only eat bread. And if they sang songs, they never had any music that went along with it, never any instruments or anything. They simply sang. And they tried to make sure that they never experienced any pleasure at all because they thought that the flesh was evil. They thought it was bad. And so rather than, and they tried to take no pleasure in anything because in pleasure, in fleshly pleasures and physical pleasure, there was only sin. And so they tried to rid all pleasure from their lives. And so that's kind of the extreme opposite end of what sometimes people think of as hedonism. The hedonist being he who tries to go out and have all pleasurable things all the time and thinks about nothing but pleasure. And I think that understanding of hedonism is incorrect. I think there's a much more balanced way of understanding true hedonism, which is something that's closer to the middle, not Puritanism, not what's sometimes thought of as hedonism, but this idea of kind of tracking in the middle, of finding a narrow path where you do in fact find pleasure and you do in fact enjoy things, but your entire life is not necessarily simply geared around trying to find any pleasure and all the time. That there's more to life just than pleasure, but certainly life should include enjoyment of things that do in fact bring us pleasure, and that there should be intentionality about enjoying those things. And so if you enjoy a particular food, perhaps for me it's steak. I don't go out and eat steak all the time. That's also not healthy. And so you have to find that narrow path where you eat steak sometimes, and when you do, you intentionally eat it because you enjoy it so much, whatever food it might be for you, but intentionally going out and finding those things. In Greek, the word hedone, and that's where we get the word hedonism, the word hedone literally translates as the word desire. And so for these individuals who are tracking that narrow path, perhaps hopefully they're going out and they're finding what they desire. They're willfully and intentionally and purposefully focused on that thing that brings them pleasure, that thing that they desire, and so that they enjoy it to the best of their ability. And so tracking that narrow path, because I think again that the true hedonist is not out for any and all and every pleasure all the time, but understanding that if you do in fact indulge or overindulge, and the Greeks had a phrase for this. They said, "He who overindulges bulge." If you overindulge, you bulge. And so the idea here is that you shouldn't. You should seek those things that you desire, but you shouldn't seek them any and all of the time and every time. And so if you eat too much food, then you are going to bulge. Or perhaps if you overindulge in alcohol, then you're going to have to suffer the hangover. And so it's finding that narrow track where you have pleasure, but you don't seek pleasure so much and so often that it brings you pain. Because if you seek that pleasure all the time, one of two things will happen. If you overindulge, again, there's going to be unhealthy, like I'm sticking with food or alcohol in this case, there's going to be unhealthy results in the sense of that there's going to be some pain that comes along with that overindulgence. But also, if you overindulge often or too often, say if you enjoy, for me when I was a child, it was playing video games. And if you enjoy playing video games but you play a game too much, it becomes common, and after a while you lose the pleasure that comes along with playing that game simply because you've overindulged, and it becomes boring and it becomes mundane. And so you have to find that narrow path that where you still get the pleasure but you get to avoid the pain as well. Right, and so hedonists yeah. Okay, so as we're looking at this idea of the two extremes of hedonism here, Puritanism, and the one who's out for any and all and every desire, when it comes to this fifth thing, I I'm going to come at it a little differently rather than just tell you. I wanted to kind of talk about the difference quickly in a saint and a devil, or a hero perhaps and a villain, and we'll kind of come into this fifth one as we move forward. What is it in the life of a saint or in the life of a hero that makes us look at them and perhaps wish that we could be like them, or makes us wonder what it is that perhaps motivates, say, a saint, for example, thinking of somebody like perhaps Mother Teresa or perhaps a Gandhi. These individuals the reason that we call them saints, or the reason that we call someone a hero, is because they have gone above and beyond the call of duty. They've done something um, that is more than most people ever do or ever will do. And so, um, with the saint, I'll use Mother Teresa there for an example, as she spent her life taking care of the sick and the dying and the poor, the starving, there in Calcutta, uh, as she would spend all of her life and as she spent her energies, and she gave of herself endlessly to these individuals. Um, we call her a saint because she went above and beyond, meaning that most of us are not going to quit our jobs and go into Calcutta and begin to live the life that she did, where she gave up her life. She gave all, she gave everything. Most of us aren't going to do that. It's above and beyond what most of us are going to do. It's true that many of us will help those in need as we can, but she dedicated her life, her entire life and her entire existence, to trying to help those poor people there in Calcutta. That's above and beyond. That's more than most of us are going to do. That's the type of thing that saints do, or it's the type of thing that heroes might do. And so if you have a firefighter who risks his life running into a burning building to save someone, well, that's a heroic action. Why? Because most of us aren't going to do that. That's above and beyond what most of us are going to do. Or if you've got a soldier who performs some type of action there in battle, perhaps uh, self-sacrificing, or perhaps going back into danger over and over again to save his comrades, to pull the other injured soldiers off the front line. We call them a hero because they've done something that other people haven't done. They've gone above and beyond. The funny thing about heroes and about saints is that most of the time, or when you ask them about their saintliness, or you ask them about their heroicism, they tend to not know what it is that we're talking about. They tend to look at us and say, I don't know why people are making such a fuss over this. I was simply, doing my job. Or if you ask that to Mother Teresa, she's probably going to look at you and say, well, I've only been doing precisely what I just thought I should have been doing the whole time, just like everybody else is doing what they thought they should have been doing the whole time. And so when you see the interview of the firefighter who has saved people from that fire at risk of their own life, and you're asking them about being a hero, they say, well, I'm just doing my job. That's what I do. They don't seem to recognize themselves as saintly or as heroic. But what is it in their life? What is it in their actions that makes the rest of us look at them and hold them up there on that pedestal, and makes us wish that we could emulate them, and wish perhaps even that our children could emulate them? We hold them up and say, look, here are these individuals. We should all strive to at least have some of what they have. We should incorporate some of what they are into our lives. What is it that we're looking for? What is it that is in them that they're doing? What is it precisely that we're trying to, or that we wish we could incorporate into our own lives? And I think to kind of discover that, not on a heroic or on a saintly level, as I said, most of us won't ever reach that level. But in order to kind of think about that in our own lives, and hopefully to kind of drive home a little bit the point, let's go back to this idea of the brain and the vat. If you recall, in a past lecture, I asked you or at least I hope I did. In my classroom, I asked my students, because I often forget what I've talked about in the past, and in this case, I've forgotten if I mentioned this, but I'm pretty sure I have. Imagine that we had the ability that scientists could take your brain out of your skull and put it into a vat, hook it up with electrodes, and tie it into the computer, and then in your brain, right, with all those electrodes attached to your brain, that they could pump into your mind any life that you wanted. So you could have a tremendous life. You could have any life that you desire. And so if you want a life that's filled with pleasure, you can have that life. If you want a life that's filled with fame and fortune, you can have that life. Would you do it? Would you want to be that brain in a vat so that you could have, that they could program using that computer and the electrodes? They could program any life that you want. So you could frame up into your life, into your brain in the vat, the perfect spouse for you. You could program that in. Perfect children. That perfect family, whatever that might look like, for you, parents, kids, however you want to frame up your life, you could do it. Now, you can also, in that life, in that perfect life, it's not that it just has to be perfect and that there are no bad times. You can program bad times into there as well. And so if you want to overcome cancer, well, that's part of it. You can do that. If you want those kinds of struggles, you can have any struggle that you want in that computer program. But you get to program the life you want. So if you want to live a life where you have no family, you were an orphan and you grew up alone, and you become rich and famous, and you can be anything you want. Now there's always some type of restriction here. You can't live forever. You have to die at some point. But if you wanted to, you could program it where you didn't have to suffer through your parents' death. Perhaps you could die at a young age, or perhaps they live to be, I just saw on the news one lady lived to be 108, and so if your parents live to be 108 and you die at say 88, that's still a rich long life, but you don't have to endure the death of your parents. After all, it's a computer program, and well, they're just computer parts of it, and so you don't really have to watch your parents go through the pain of you dying either. They're just part of the computer program. Now, you don't know it's a computer program. You just think it's life. Like you think right now, the life that you're living is just a regular life. There's nothing in there that that any different. You might be part of a computer program, in fact, right now, but in that case, just as is the case now, you don't know that you're a computer program. You don't feel like you're a computer program. It would be just as real to you as what you're experiencing right now is equally real to you. And so the question here is, would you do it? Would you take that life in the vat where you're just a brain in the vat? Would you accept a life like that? Because you could have anything you wanted. And so in my class, as I asked this question, most of my students, probably over 90% of them, say no, they would not take the brain in the vat. And for various reasons, they'll state, I wouldn't do it because it would be fake. And of course, I'm playing devil's advocate, so I always say, but you would know it's fake. It would be just as real to you as it is now. And another would say, well, it wouldn't be a real life, it would just be the imitation of life. And yes, but you wouldn't know, that it's this or that. Well, I wouldn't take it because I think one of them one time said it's not natural. It's like, well, yeah, it would be as natural as what you think you've got now. So any of the objections that come up, or if they speak out in favor and say, yes, I would do it, I try to, play devil's advocate and pull them back and forth. And so there's this long conversation about whether or not they would or would not be that brain in the vat. In the end, though, because I do that partway through the semester, as I hopefully did it for you, and then here at the end I bring it up again. We go back to this brain in the vat question. In the end, I wouldn't take the brain in the vat, and it really hasn't anything to do with me and the good life that I could have if I were to program myself into that computer, into that brain in the vat. I wouldn't take that brain in the vat option, but it really doesn't have anything to do with me. Rather, instead, it has to do with my family. Imagine for a moment that, as I said, both my parents are still living, and the holidays are particularly important for my family. And so Christmas has always been a big deal, and it still is. And so we get together, and we have a good family. It's a family that doesn't fight. We enjoy each other's company, and especially there at the holidays. So we get together on Christmas at some point during the day. We'll get together and we'll eat and we'll open presents, and it's a wonderful time. Now imagine that I did take the brain in the vat option, and so then to also imagine that the scientist had the ability to transport my brain in the vat, and so there we are, as the stockings are being taken down and we're beginning to open them and open presents and enjoy the meal. The scientists have brought my brain in the vat, and there it is sitting there in the living room. And they know that as a computer program, I am having that Christmas experience that I have programmed into the computer. I'm having that experience there, and so I'm having a wonderful Christmas with my computer program family, whatever that looks like. But for my family, there they are in the real world, not the programmed world, not the virtual world, but there they are, either enjoying Christmas or perhaps even enduring whatever hardships have occurred in the real world. I might be having this perfect Christmas over here with my virtual family, but my actual family out here in the real world might be struggling at this particular point. Perhaps perhaps one of my parents has died of cancer recently, and so yes, I'm having a good life there, brain in the vat, and my parent, rather than having died of cancer, is with me on that Merry Christmas morning. But perhaps my other parent, my real parent, the one that's sitting out here in the real world, they're enduring the loss of their lifelong partner. I don't take the brain in the vat, not because I don't think it would be a good life. It would be a good life. But I won't take the brain in the vat because of the other people who are around me. Because I want to be here with them, and I want to be here for them, and I want to be able to make a difference in the lives of my family and also in the lives of other individuals who I also influence and who are also part of my world. I want to be able to influence their lives as well. I don't take the brain in the vat, but it hasn't anything really to do with me, and it has everything to do with the individuals who I love and who are around me and who I want to be here for and to care for. Which brings us, I think, to that fifth thing that I think we need in order to have a good life, and that is selflessness. I think there has to be an aspect of selflessness within our lives in order for us to, in fact, have a good life. Because if all we're ever focused on is simply ourselves, then I don't think we're going to have a good, productive, engaged life where it is more, that more has been done simply than to bring pleasure to ourselves. And so selflessness, I think, is that fifth key, that fifth element in order for us to have a good life, or in order for us to have that flourishing life. Remember us talking in a previous lecture about the idea of eudaimonia, which is that Greek word that just translates as flourishing. And then I told you the story about the tree from South America that couldn't stand up because it didn't have anything to fight against. And then we talked a little bit about how plants draw nutrients from the soil and sunlight. Their leaves draw in sunlight, all of these things that they need in order to flourish, to grow strong, and to have that good life. In order to have that kind of flourishing, in order to have that kind of good life, I think there needs to be that element of selflessness that goes along with it, so that we focus not just on ourselves, but we focus on others as well. I have undergone a couple of depressions, 3 or 4 throughout my life. And one of the things that I have found that helps me to get the depression to lift is to stop focusing on myself and to begin focusing on other people and other things around me. And if I'll stop focusing on me and start focusing on others, I find that is how I will get the depression to cease. That's how I can overcome and get through that whatever it is that is causing me to endure that particular span of darkness. And so there with the saints and with the heroes, that is that key element. That's that thing that they have that the rest of us are wishing to emulate, that we want to have in our own lives. That's the reason we hold them up, is that selflessness. That's what we want to embrace for ourselves, but it's also something that we want to see that we can pass on to our children so that they can live a life that goes beyond simply themselves. And so that's why we hold up saints, and that's why we hold up heroes. And again, they've gone above and beyond the call of duty. I don't think most of us can, or at least most of us won't, live a life of selflessness to the degree that, say, a Mother Teresa or that firefighter who goes into that burning building will, in fact, they live up to that higher standard. Even though they don't see themselves as living up to that higher standard, they do, at least in the rest of our view, they do live up to a higher standard. But I think that that key element there is going to be something that's important for each and every one of us. So I also think that that fifth element is the key to opening the first four. And so within those first four, I think that fifth one should influence all of them. And so as you lead a life of contemplativeness, meaning that as you make your plans, as you contemplate what you want life to be and what you want life to be like, there should be more to it than just you contemplating what you want for yourself and what you want the end of your life to look like for you. And instead, that selflessness should come in, and you should contemplate a life of what the plans that I make should be plans that will also help and benefit the people around me, the people that I love, the people that I care about. So selflessness should also be part of a contemplative life. Selflessness should also be part of an active life, meaning that as you go out and you begin to do and put your plans into action, that there's that selfless aspect that goes along with your actions as well. The third one, when it comes to selflessness, is a little bit trickier. And so when it comes to fatalism, you have no promises in advance as to how your actions will succeed or not succeed, or even if they will be perceived. And what that means is that, have you ever done something that was selfless, something that was good, and you did it for this individual over here, and they didn't even realize it. They didn't even know that you had done something that for you was self-sacrificial. It was something that was significant. They don't even know that you did it. It was not perceived. Now, if you're a parent, you have this experience quite often. But even as one adult does for another adult, sometimes the other doesn't realize what you've done. And so it can be the case that you'll do something and it won't be perceived. And that's part of it. And that's why fatalism in this particular case and selflessness are discussing them here at the same time, because it's just the case that often you'll behave selfless and people won't realize that you've done something that was selfless. They will not perceive your actions. Also, when it comes to selflessness and fatalism, and you just have to accept this as well, sometimes when you do something that you mean to be selfless and that you mean to happen for good reasons, sometimes people won't perceive what you've done, but sometimes people will also misperceive what you've done. And so you'll do something sacrificial and for some good reason, but people will think that you're not trying to help them, but instead they'll perceive you as trying to harm them. And that's something that you have to accept as well. Now, again, if you're a parent, you have this experience, right? Because your kids will often realize you're doing something, but they'll misunderstand what you're doing, and they'll think you're doing it, for a reason other than why you are. You're trying to help them, and they might misperceive it as not trying to help them, but rather trying to harm them. As it's true for parents and children, it is also true for adult to adult. And so many people, many good people, have been misunderstood, misperceived, and have suffered because of the sometimes selfless things that they do, that they're meant for good, and people misunderstand them. And you simply have to accept the fact that both of those things are going to happen. People aren't going to realize you're trying to behave selfish. You'll do something selfless. They won't perceive it. Sometimes you'll do something selfless that you mean for good. and people will misperceive it. And you just have to accept that that's part of life as well. And then selflessness there with hedonism as well. We do know that there is a degree of pleasure that goes along with doing your duty, meaning that there is a degree of satisfaction that goes along with doing the things that you know that you're supposed to do. And so now you have endured a semester of philosophy, and you've done something that you know that you should have done. It's something that's going to bring you greater pleasure, perhaps not because of the class directly, but getting the degree. You've endured the work that is required in order to get a college education. And so now you're going to have the pleasure that comes with enduring this struggle, enduring through this difficult time. And so there's going to be a sense of satisfaction and a degree of pleasure, that hedonism that comes along with doing this. And probably my guess is that many of you are doing it not simply for yourselves, you're doing it hopefully also to bring a better, richer life to your loved ones, perhaps your children, perhaps to a spouse or whoever it may be. And that's why you're getting this degree, is to better not your life, but also to better the lives of those around you as well. And so there is a selflessness that comes along with hedonism, with pleasure, and doing the things that you know you're supposed to do as well. So when it comes to having a good life, I do think that these 5 things are important. I think they're important for mostly everyone. I've yet to run across someone and I thought, well, that probably just won't be important to them and to their lives. It seems to be something that is significant. It seems to be something that everyone, if they embrace them, that it can help each and every one of us to have a good life. And so here we have this idea of the good life is something that is active, it's contemplative, it's somewhat fatalistic, it's pleasurable. But I think the most important thing that we can add to all of those aspects within our lives in order to have a good life is the idea of selflessness. Here in the end, this particular lecture, perhaps more of my opinion, perhaps more of just thoughts from myself here than I've really done throughout the semester. And so here at the end, I add to, in this one, that's my opinion. Take it for what it's worth. If it's helpful for you, and perhaps if it brings you a good and better life, embrace those things. And hopefully, as I say, that will bring about a life that you can have, a life that will be good and well lived, so that in the end you will be satisfied, and that you will be happy, and that somehow you will have found and lived up to the expectations that life will have brought to you, the things that you have desired all along. And so in this final lecture, and as we part, I do wish to each and every one of you the best of luck, and a happy and a good life.